Okay, welcome to the third and final video where we're going to be talking about the Australopithecus africanus, the South African Australopithecus. So the first species ever discovered in the genus Australopithecus and the geologically youngest one out of the three that we'll cover here. Okay, so Australopithecus africanus, the first discovered Australopith. And these are probably the two most famous specimens in the species, the Tong child and Mrs. Place. So we'll be talking about these two. Okay, Australopithecus africanus as a species existed from 3 million to 2 million years ago. Right, and as I mentioned before, its name literally translates to southern ape from Africa. So the most famous sites in South Africa where africanus is found is Tong, Sterkfontein, and Makapanska. As you can see, all within the country of South Africa. And because South Africa isn't volcanically active, there are no ashes that can be dated, so we can't use potassium argon. So we have to use other methods such as biostratigraphy, paleomagnetism, I covered those two, and U-series, uranium series, which is a type of numerical absolute dating technique. I didn't go over it, but it basically follows the same principle as potassium argon, just with different elements and isotopes. And Australopithecus africanus lived in an open grassland. Okay, so this is perhaps the most famous specimen from the species. Again, the first one discovered by Raymond Dart. This is a Tong child, dated at 2.7 million years ago, and was about 3 years old when it died. So this is what the site of Tong looks like from the outside. And as I mentioned with the Kika, Tong also has an endocast. So just sediment that infilled the inside of the cranium and basically forms a negative impression of the cranium and can tell us something about what the brain looked like and its size. Okay, here are reconstructions of the Tong child. So in the past, they reconstructed like this, right? It just looks like some sad, morose little child. With computers these days, we can reconstruct it more accurately and precisely. And now the Tong child is reconstructed as this new, confident, fierce child. So how did the Tong child die? This one is very interesting. So on the left here is the Tong child. You can see at the bottom of the eye socket, there's a big puncture mark there. And there are some, the floor of the eye socket has also been removed here. So these marks are very similar to that of this monkey found at a site called the Thai forest, right? And so what actually killed this monkey? Well, an eagle. So these marks are believed to have been made by eagle claws, right? And so the eagle basically grabbed the Tong child by its face and lifted it up to its nest where it was eaten later. So very sad, gruesome death. So a little more history that I want to continue with the Tong child. And so this is a quote from Sir Arthur Keith, who was actually one of the paleoanthropologists who studied Piltdown Man. So, you know, it wasn't like he was an objective observer, but I just want to use this quote to illustrate how panned Professor Dart's study was of the Tong child when he said that this was actually an ancient hominin and more likely to be an ancestor of all humans rather than Piltdown. So I will read the quote. Professor Dart has made a discovery of great importance. He has shown that anthropoid apes had extended into the Pleistocene. He has found an extinct relative of the chimpanzee and gorilla, but one with more man-like features that are possessed by either. And this throws light on the history of anthropoid apes, but not that of man. So you can see very clearly here that Arthur Keith did not think Tong child was a hominin. He thought it was an ancient ape. And many paleoanthropologists felt that way. And so again, Tong child was panned. It was not believed that hominins arose in Africa. It was not believed that a large human-sized brain came later in human evolution. It wasn't until a second discovery made at Sterkfontein, another famous africanus site in South Africa, This was discovered by Robert Broom, and nicknamed Mrs. Place. Nicknamed that because the genus for this specimen was originally Plesianthropus. So it's just abbreviated, nicknamed Mrs. Place. And this is Mrs. Place. So it's a wonderful specimen. And the key thing to note here was that it's an adult. So Tong child was not an adult, and your morphology actually changes a bit as you age from child to adult. So it was tough to tell just from the Tong child what the adult morphology would have looked like. And this kind of went against Dart as he was advocating that Tong child was a hominid. Well, it wasn't until Robert Broom discovered Mrs. Place, an adult, which we now know as Australopithecus africanus, and it very much has hominid-like traits, as we'll see. So when Mrs. Place was discovered, right, Arthur Keith kind of was humbled, and then he published this quote. I was one of those who took the point of view that when the adult form was discovered, it would prove to be near akin to the living African anthropoids, the gorilla and chimpanzee. Like Professor LeGros-Clark, I am now convinced, on the evidence submitted by Dr. Robert Broom, that Professor Dart was right and that I was wrong. The Australopithecus A are in or near the line which culminated in the human form. So Arthur Keith realized he was wrong. He apologized. He ate his words, and he did it in public. So kudos to him, I guess. So Raymond Dart, in addition to discovering, analyzing, and publishing on the Tong child, also had this other theory, which he called the killer ape theory. So he found all of these bones that Australopithecus africanus was associated with, and he saw a bone was broken in a particular way that had a very sharp edge. He saw the shoulder blades, which looked like they could have been used as shovels because they were flat and wide. And so he thought that Africanus was actually intentionally modifying these bones to be used as tools, and he named this the osteodontochoratic culture. So osteo means bone, donto means teeth, choratic means horn. So he literally thought that Africanus was making bone tools so it could hunt other animals, hence killer ape. But then comes along this very famous taphonomist called Bob Brain, and he asked the question, well, maybe Africanus, they weren't the hunters, but they were the hunted. And he actually conducted a classic study where he threw out a bunch of, I think it was goat bones, to dogs, had them chew it up, and basically what he saw was the character of those chewed up bones matched exactly the fossils associated with Africanus that Dart thought was used as tools. So all those sharp bones, they were just a function of being consumed by carnivores. So the more parsimonious and now accepted explanation is that Africanus wasn't shaping these bones. They just happen to look like that because they just happen to look that way because that's what happens when carnivores eat and scavenge them. And yes, he wrote this classic book now, The Hunters or the Hunted. This is what he looks like. And so instead of being hunters, Africanus, it was believed, maybe looked something more like this. They were the hunted. They weren't at the top of the food chain yet. Okay, now let's look at some traits of Africanus. So what are the primitive traits? Small brain size, ape-like, 410 cubic centimeters. Moderate prognathism, not as much as in, say, afarensis. In terms of derived human-like traits, rounded cranial vault. So if you remember when I went over morphological trends, it was not only a larger brain, but a more rounded cranium. That was a more derived human-like trait. So Australopithecus africanus starts to exhibit that. And you can see that compared with afarensis, which is a lot more kind of oblong, looks almost like a football, whereas afarensis looks maybe more like a soccer ball, if you will. If we look at the teeth, Africanus had small canines with no diastema. This is derived even more so than afarensis. But it still had a U-shaped dental arcade, parallel cheek teeth rows. this is a primitive ape-like trait. Also, africanus has what are known as anterior pillars, so these kind of raised pillars of bone that line each side of the nasal cavity. That's unique to africanus. What purpose does it serve? That's still an open question. Now, if we look at the postcrania, we see that africanus had longer forelimbs, which suggests it was a better climber than afarensis. So africanus had longer forelimbs, even more so than afarensis. So one way to kind of keep track of the difference between africanus and afarensis is that africanus in the cranium and the jaw, so in the skull, it's more derived relative to afarensis, but from the neck down, africanus is more primitive than afarensis. But of course, africanus was a hominin, so it showed bipedal traits. So the hip blades of africanus are wrapped towards the front. So you can see here, africanus hip blades look more similar to humans compared to a chimpanzee. And again, wrapped towards the front, these hip blades means reorientation of the gluteus minimus and medius, which changes their function, and now they act as hip stabilizers. Very important for bipedal walking. So again, we have this mosaic evolution, right? Long arms, right? Still arboreal lifestyle for africanus, but it also has these bipedal traits like these wrapped hip blades. So again, human traits didn't appear all at once in human evolution. They appeared piecemeal and at different times. Okay, so africanus, again, here we have Mrs. Place. Here's a summary of those primitive traits, which I covered. Here are the derived traits. And Australopithecus as a whole, as a genus, here is just a nice summary review slide of those primitive traits, of those derived traits. You can see the 3 species and their geological age ranges, some of the key traits of Australopithecus, and of course they're found in Eastern Africa. This is Anamensis afarensis, and South Africa. This is Africanus. Again, from previous lecture, we know that most hominin fossil sites are found in East Africa and South Africa. Okay, so that concludes this lecture. Right, in the first video, I introduced the genus Australopithecus. I talked about some of the defining traits of that genus. Then I went over the 2 species found in Eastern Africa. The oldest Australopithecus species is Anamensis, and its descendant, Afarensis, for which we have so many amazing fossils. This is the most well-known Australopithecus species. And then in this video, I covered Australopithecus africanus from South Africa, the geologically youngest one, but of course, the first one discovered that really rewrote how paleoanthropologists thought about human evolution. Big brains did not come first, and the birthplace of humanity was in Africa.